Welcome to another episode of Two Average Joes. I'm Joseph St. John, one of the Two Average Joes. I have 30 years of law enforcement, and we have been discussing the Michigan murders. And my partner here is Robert Baker, who was actually Joey back in the day. So let's understand Two Average Joes.
Yeah. So
and you're an attorney?
Yep, local attorney in Michigan. I have been since 1997. Primarily practiced criminal law and litigation. Been involved on the side of I've met Gary Leiterman in prison several times. His family had hired me, or a little PR firm that I had a part of. He was filing a brief with the Supreme Court of Michigan trying to get out on what's called a 6500 motion, and he was unsuccessful, of course. So we're here to talk about Gary Leiterman today, but we're not going to talk a whole lot about it because we're still running through the victims. We're up to the third victim, which is Jane Louise Mixer, and she was 23. She was a first-year law student, and she was killed. And Gary was convicted of her murder in 2005. Okay, and what happened, as a precursor, Gary in 1969 was a 27-year-old pharmaceutical representative, and he was traveling the country for this pharmaceutical rep on interestingly, Eastern Airlines, and that'll come into play later. We tried to figure out. He thought he was out of town in 1969 in March when these murders occurred, but it's hard to go back 35 years and prove where you were on a given moment, as you can imagine. Eastern Airlines had since gone bankrupt, and they didn't exist back when he was trying to go through this. So anyway, he lived in Westland, which is east of Ypsilanti and Arbor, midway between Detroit and Ann Arbor. And interestingly, John Norman Collins and his buddy Manuel, I forgot what his first name was, but Anthony or something like that, Andrew, I think it was Andrew, they were running a burglary ring, and they had I believe it was the day before the day of, stolen a 22 right over near the Denton Cemetery where Miss Mixer was left. But so Gary's DNA ends up on Miss Mixer, and we're not going to go way into it, but at the time, this murder was only the third in a string. There was one in 1967, one in 1968. Interestingly, in my research, I had found, I had interviewed Larry Mathewson, probably in 09, I believe it was. And he was a EMU campus cop at the time, but really involved in the investigation. And Mr. Mathewson had mentioned several things. One was that John Norman Collins was believed to be involved in a murder that occurred in Iowa. And I looked it up, sent it to Joe. It was the woman's last name was Collins, which was interesting. And then secondarily, really interesting, was there was another ride board issue. If you recall from our two previous episodes, Jane Mixer had put her name up on a ride board or two. It seemed like there was one definitely in the student union. Read two different places where it said it was also in the law quad, but she had placed her name trying to get a ride home for spring break to her family in Muskegon. This Iowa murder, very similar. So.
Yes, we're going to have a link down there for that. Just kind of, everybody can kind of keep up with this. It's complicated. I think it's and we're again, we want to stay on task here, but it's complicated because we know there was a murder in California.
Definitely.
We know that there's this Iowa situation, and as I said, the link will be down there. And then you get Mixer being involved in this. And this is something I want to really clarify and drive home. Up until this DNA, which we'll get into in a little bit, is found, Mixer is seen as being part of the Michigan murders. All of the books you're going to read, everything we have, she's part of this murder. So she's not and then there was this other weird murder at the same time. I mean, she is definitely put into that trap. And I think that that's real important. Now, we don't want to get too lost into this because actually, when we go through all of the victims, we're going to come back to John Norman Collins's trial, which is an interesting thing. And then we will end this program talking about Gary Leiterman.
Yes.
Yeah, and it'll be pretty detailed talking about Gary too. Gary is not perfect by any stretch of imagination, and we're not trying to make it sound like it. But Gary does not have a history of violence.
None.
Okay.
Zero.
This is not a guy that went in jail for attacking people and stuff. And there's some things that were said about Gary. We'll discuss them. And we're not saying he's perfect. It's just we're saying, in the overall picture, Gary's not a person that would have drawn their attention. Okay.
No.
The next part, and I think this is equally as important, is Gary's situation really stems from something that we all think we know about, which is called DNA. Okay, because we watched it on TV and we do not understand the complexities of it. And we do not understand that DNA, just like everything else, has rules of evidence.
Yeah.
Okay. It is the gold standard. We said that earlier at a meeting we had. But it still has the rule of evidence.
Yeah.
And that's going to be one of the situations that we talk about with Gary. Gary is, and I'll let you tell the rest of the story. He did get convicted and was on probation for writing some prescription. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah. He had gotten kidney stones, and he got OxyContin, I think it was, that he got hooked on. And so they arrested him, and they found that he had script pads evidently in his car when they arrested him. But here's what's really interesting about this, and I don't think it's ever been reported anywhere because it's misstated. Okay, so Michigan has a diversion program. It's called 7411. That's the statute. And I think it's MCL 750.7411 or something like that. The 7411 is absolutely correct. So it's a diversion program that if you successfully complete this diversion program, and it's pretty light, actually. It's, we use it all the time for a first-time drug offender in Michigan. If you go through it, your conviction is expunged like it never occurred. So had Gary Leiterman come into my office and said, hey, so just know that this is the way they caught Gary Leiterman is that the governor at the time, and I think it was Engler, had passed a law in 2001. And he said, hey, every convicted felon in Michigan has to submit to a DNA test. Okay. Gary was not a convicted felon at that time because his conviction was expunged. So had Gary come into my office and said, Mr. Baker, do I have to comply with this? I would say, no, you do not. You are not a convicted felon at this point. You can carry a gun. You can do everything that a convicted felon cannot do. Right. So I don't think that's ever been reported anywhere. It's missed by all the books because most people aren't a Michigan lawyer, which I am. And I actually use the 7411 a lot when pot now is legal in, how's it in Mississippi? Is pot legal in Mississippi?
They're working on it.
Okay, so
they did pass medical marijuana, but I'm not sure how that makes things legal. But
it'll come, but still, it's federally illegal, so I can't.
Yes, I have never quite understood that. But go ahead.
Yeah, but so they used it a lot in Michigan, or they did with minor possession charges, because you don't want to tag some kid with a couple of joints on him. That's what I don't understand about the United States. They list it as a Schedule I drug, which is just like heroin and cocaine and methamphetamines and everything else that's Schedule I. But marijuana, I guess it goes back to Reefer Madness, which we used to talk about. Yeah, go watch Reefer Madness. Look it up on YouTube.
You'll understand.
But anyway, so Gary submits his DNA, And Gary told me when he did this, so he's a surgical nurse, all right, and he goes into the Paw Paw Michigan State Police place, and they're doing the DNA test, and they didn't know shit from Shinola about doing this. As a Michigan State trooper doing the DNA test, and he's like, he grabbed it by the wrong end, and then he swabbed Gary's mouth. Then he put his hands on the end that was just in Gary's mouth. And Gary's like, man, my DNA is all over everything, this thing. And then, so my understanding, and I'll have to do, and hopefully in the postscript, I know a little bit better about it, but the DNA sample was sent to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, which was backlogged, as you can imagine, because every felon in the state of Michigan had submitted one of these. Mm-hmm. And they had sent it out to, I believe, an outside lab, and they found no matches. Mm-hmm. And then I think 2 or 3 years later, they did it again, and they did find a match. Not only did they find one match, I think they found 3 matches. Okay, there were at least 2. Okay, one came back to a guy named John Rules. Okay, John Rules in 1969 was 4 years old. Mm-hmm. This other match, I think it came back to Weissman, mm-hmm. the Jane Mixer's boyfriend, but I think there may have been another one. Mm-hmm. In reading the only source material that we have, which is of the books that I've ad nauseum mm-hmm. related back to, and then the trial transcript of Gary Leiterman's, which I haven't made it all the way through again yet, but I'm working on that. But so I'm going to throw something in there, Joe.
Yeah, I just think that everybody, he willfully gives his DNA sample. Okay. Right. Probably was not the best thing to do. If you had legally told him, you would have went there. The thing now to remember is now, and I've said this in the last episode, and let me say it again. DNA is not in you. There isn't some magical DNA box here, like your fingerprint, your finger comes up. DNA is of you. It's everywhere. In other words, just in case you're listening to this and you're trying to get that balance on DNA, if you went to Hardee's today and you walked in and got a biscuit, you left your DNA all over the place.
Yeah.
Okay. The bathroom, over there on the table. Your DNA is everywhere. It's not in you. There's no magical fingerprint for DNA. Okay. It's your essence. It's your being.
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody could take your DNA and put it somewhere else without you being there. Now, they couldn't do that with your fingerprint. Okay. But we have actually made arrests where we went and picked up a cigarette butt and did the DNA test and then matched it up with people. Meaning somebody that was, nefarious could have took your DNA off that same thing and put it somewhere.
Right.
Okay. So clear that up with DNA, because I still think that's the biggest problem. They think it's of you. You got to have your DNA in here. It's not in you. It's of you. Okay. You left your DNA everywhere you went last week.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the salient part of the DNA is that there was a drop of blood on the victim's hand. Okay. And it was not smeared or anything. So it was a drop that dropped off. And it came back to this John Rules guy who was 4 years old at the time. Well, he grew up to stab his mother to death. Okay. Tragically. And his DNA, Gary Leiterman's DNA, and this pantyhose was in the same lab at the same time. Okay. And this being the lab that the supervisor was having other people take his test for certification. And this being the lab that had the female lab technician that had brought her husband's underwear in to have it tested because she thought he was cheating on her. All right. So this is not the stellar.
Yeah, this is not professional. Let's just keep that in.
Right. So Gary's comes back as being on there was in 2 or 3 locations. Okay. One was, so Miss Mixer had pantyhose on at the time of her killing. And they found it in 3 or 4 spots on Miss Mixer's pantyhose. And this is
Just
what
happened to be in the lab at the same time that his DNA was.
yeah. And this is what Gary was saying. And I don't know whether this is true, but this is what Gary said. They couldn't find Jane Mixer's DNA on those pantyhose, even though she was menstruating at the time. Mm-hmm. Gary's shows up like a bright new penny. That's what he would say. That's what he'd say all the time. And it's in some pleadings because he did some improper pleadings on his own, trying to get out, saying, hey, man, this DNA is not, this is hokey stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And then, and that one, I saw the DNA test, and I am really have a jaundiced eye towards these DNA tests because they baffle the jury with bullshit as far as the calculation goes with statistical analysis, because they'll go, it's 1 in 263 quadrillion or something. I don't even know how many zeros that is, but as far as I know, there's only about 8 billion people on the planet, if it's even that.
Right.
So that number isn't right. Oh. So in the known universe, maybe of I don't know, planets, not even, I don't even know. So that number is nonsensical. But then I don't even know how they come up with that. Okay, because we're not going to get way deep in it. And we probably will at the end. But DNA is a twisted helical ladder, and there's different ways that they measure it and to see whether or not it matches or not. And it's my understanding that we match monkeys by like 99% of our DNA matches monkeys. So there's 1% that's, I guess, unique to humans. And I don't know how many are unique to us individually. I've been told it's about 133 or 135. Maybe I'm wrong. And I'll clear that up when we get to that part. But in Michigan, just like they do with, I think, Joe, with fingerprints, if there's enough curves or whatever that match, you're a match. All right. Well, that doesn't really make you a match. As the Madrid bombing suspect.
Yes. The Madrid bombing suspect. We don't want to get lost in there, but there's your fingerprint evidence right there.
Yeah. They found this guy guilty of this Madrid bombing that had never been to Madrid. But anyway, so there's this twisted helix in Michigan. 13 is enough out of 133 matches. And I don't even know if that's true, because I had heard that when you mix 2 or 3 people's DNA, it gets very, very iffy and shaky as to whether or not you can match it, because you could have matches of the different elements of the tree of, or the twisted ladder thing. It becomes very hard to read. So they did this YSTR test, which is something where you're only testing the Y chromosome, which I'm getting way deep in it, but I'm just saying that a good defense attorney, and see, this is what I was talking to Joe about earlier, is, okay, Gary Gabrey was Gary Leiterman's defense attorney, and he was known as a pretty good prosecutor in a county, I think it was Barry or Berrien, prior to losing his job there for some reasons. And this was one of his first major defenses that he had done, being a defense attorney. And I don't know if you know it, but it's different trying a case as a defense attorney than when you have the whole support of the state behind you.
Yeah, let me emphasize something here. Let me interrupt you. We call that home field advantage.
Big time.
You're at the home field advantage. And if your judges all come from the history of being prosecutors themselves, that's a big home field advantage.
Big time. So you will find, or if you go in and you watch anything and you see defense attorneys going down in flames with constitutional motions, which I file every day, all day, and I lose more than I should win. And I just keep coming back. Like I call myself a Bobo doll, which I don't even think they make anymore. But when Joe and I grew up, they had this little sand-filled blow-up thing that was a clown with a big red nose, and you punch it,
right,
and it would go down and pop right back up.
But the Bobo doll, that's what you called it, right? 4 or 5 hits and it was done.
True that. Well,
greatly disappointed that it wouldn't take a bigger butt whipping.
That's true. But
you keep going. You just keep coming back up.
Bobo didn't consume massive amounts of alcohol like I do to come.
That's right. You got to keep that something there. I should have filled it up with that.
That is true. So anyway, not to get way lost in the DNA side of life. But
Mm.
I believe Mr. Gregory, in his defense, depended heavily on this contamination. And this is where Joe likes to quote it, but the prosecutor said that is, I'm paraphrasing, lost to history. Well,
Yes. The prosecutor, when you get, I just don't know who the 12 jurors were.
God, I'm struggling with that.
If you could go, his only answer for contaminated evidence was it's lost to history. And you sat in a room and go, I kind of understand that.
Yeah. So you got a 4-year-old's blood on it. No, they tried to say that, well, he was there.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that. The original thing was that the kid was there. See, at some point, we have to have smarter jurors because this is just, let me stop you with a public service announcement. This could happen to you.
Yes.
There's the end of my public service announcement. In case you wonder why we keep beating this to death. This could happen to you or someone you love.
Yeah, and we're several episodes away from John Norman Collins, but at least John Norman Collins' jury was out for 4 or 5 days before they found him guilty. The Gary Leiterman jury was out for 4 hours. Okay, and this is a cautionary tale for anybody who has a lawyer. Do not let a jury go out on a Friday.
Yeah, because they want to go home.
They do.
And if an innocent man has to die in jail, they got plans for the weekend.
Right.
I said it. I'm going to be honest with you. Going through this, and we want to really go on this with Gary, and we don't want to go too far in the woods because actually the show's going to end up with Gary. But I want everybody to kind of focus in on this with him. This murder is in 1969. He is arrested when?
In 2004, I think.
Okay. I want to ask you, where were you 5 months ago at 12 o'clock?
There you go.
5 months ago. Tell me. If you kept a calendar, you might be okay.
Maybe.
Okay, maybe. Most of us couldn't tell you where we were. Okay. That is a tremendous battle that he had to fight. He could have been out of town. He could have not been out of town.
He really believed he was, and we tried really, really hard. We tried to get some PIs and stuff to track down.
But that's a long time ago.
1969, there was no, I don't even know if they would have kept microfiche. I mean,
I will tell you something. Eastern going bankrupt wasn't good, but the fact that whether or not they would have kept that, I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. It's an unbelievable thing that it took 4 hours. But I agree with you about Friday. But I'm going to tell you something too. It's 2007. What was it when he was convicted?
2005.
2005. Okay. I still think people were mesmerized by DNA, and I still think they are.
Mm-hmm.
I taught a class one time, and I just wanted to show them about DNA because we all talk like we know it. And I started showing a film that was a science film on DNA.
Mm-hmm.
It took about 5 or 6 minutes before these kids were looking at me like, my students were like, I think Mr. St. John's gone insane. Okay, they're looking at me like, what are you showing me?
Yeah.
But my point was, and I have to give my students credit, they understood this is way more complicated than we're making. Okay. Yeah. We make DNA sound like it's not complicated. It's extremely complicated. Okay. It's extremely worrisome when you realize you leave it behind everywhere you go. Okay. DNA is not your fingerprint. And that's kind of one of the things when it starts, it's like a finger. No, my fingerprint is attached to my finger, which is attached to my hand.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. My DNA has been left everywhere I've been ever since I've been.
Right.
Okay. And that's the point where I hope that if no one gets anything out of this entire situation where we're talking about Gary, I hope that's what they get out of it. That everything's a little bit more complicated than we make it.
What I did want to say though is, okay, so they found these they said it was sweat on at least some different reports say that it was sweat on the pantyhose. I don't think that they ever conceded that scientifically or any other way. Because I was like, well, if I was cross-examining, I would say saliva, sweat. Is there a difference? Is there a way to tell a difference? Because I've got another case right now that I'm going to have to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. But so that was that one in, however, 236 quadrillion that it was a match. But then the mixer was garroted with a stocking. Okay, and in that stocking, there were skin cells that came back positive to Gary Leiterman, but it was 1 in 70,000. Okay, so 1 in 70,000. There's 7 million people in the state of Michigan, so that means that there are how many? Like 10,000 people. I don't know my math very well, but that is not a clear match. I mean, if you believe the quadrillion, which is bullshit,
right?
Then 70,000 is not even close. Okay, and so they're saying that he had to sweat to lift her, and it showed that she was dragged. Okay, pulled out of a trunk and dragged her out of the car and dragged. So I don't know how on a March day, and it's March right now, and there's snow on the ground. So
right.
And March in Michigan is a cold day. So I don't know how you're going to sweat and drop 5 drops or whatever they said that there was on there. But I just wanted to say that, and we'll circle back on the garage.
And there's something about, I've watched other things where they said it was her pantyhose, but it was not.
No. That was a large woman. They said potentially 6 feet tall, stocking that was around her neck. And they also had a blue, and I think it was blue, white, and yellow towel that was used. So supposedly the killer shot her in the temple while she was sitting in the passenger side of the car, and then used a towel to catch the blood. Who would carry around a towel? Don't know. Who would have a stocking to choke her out after you shot her twice in the head with a .22? I don't know. I mean, these are all, we'll go through the coincidences. We're rolling like it's still John Norman Collins as far as it's 1969. We wanted to do this thing on Gary so that you have a clear picture of what happens, because as we said from the beginning, law enforcement said this one's different.
Yeah. And one other thing to realize is during the course of this original Michigan murders, everybody put Jane Mixon in.
They did.
Everybody.
Yeah.
So there we go. We're going to revisit Gary next week. We didn't want to get too lost on it. I just think once you get into contaminated evidence, you have contaminated evidence. And it just makes
no reasonable doubt.
It even makes you wonder about where he's starting to say about these other things, because you just start to wonder, at what point did you even have anything out there? And I think we get bamboozled by numbers.
We do.
We get bamboozled by numbers. So we have to check that out. But next week, we're going to touch on Gary a little bit more. And then we're going to move on to the next victim. We didn't want to get too far lost on Gary, but there's, you just have to know that. And we're probably in the show going big time into Gary.
Yeah.
So there we go. So we have that. And anything else you want to say?
No, I believe that's about it. This is a complex case, and we still have, we're up to 3. There's depending on who we put in there, there's 5 more, before we get to John Norman Collins's trial, and then finish out with Gary. But
we got a lot more episodes is what he's saying.
And we're saying that, but we're also saying, here's what I don't know how we handle, but we could assume that Gary is guilty, and we could do that. And we could assume John Norman Collins is guilty, or we could assume there's some unknown people that are doing it, or there's a group of people doing it. And that's what I think we started with. And we're still kind of trying to roll that way. But there's no doubt that John Norman Collins and his fraternity brothers and people he lived with are threaded through almost every single one of these murders.
Listen, that is an understatement. We're gonna talk about that. There's every time you open this up, there's more questions than answers. So we're gonna do that. Make sure you hit like and subscribe. Make comments. Those comments are wonderful. We're going to take a look at it. Lot to be said about that crime lab. Trying to keep that in mind, and that's where we're going to go. So until next week, everybody have a good one, and
see ya.